Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at a watch that many of you are already very familiar with. It's Spinnaker's super compressor style watch, the Bradner, which was by far Spinnaker's biggest success from last year. And there are already a number of good reviews from that first iteration. And there's already some good reviews for this newer, updated version that came out 2 months ago. So I'm going to try to keep this on point and not really wander too much. Although I do want to say that I was very interested in the Bradner last year, but I never wound up getting one. Although it did increase my interest in compressor style watches, which is one of the reasons I wound up with that Vostok Scuba. And the only real competition in this price range is the limited edition Dan Henry 1970, and those are already starting to sell out. So now is really the perfect time for Spinnaker to re-release and update the Bradner. So first off, let me just say that this is a visually cool watch. Not only is it rather attractive to look at, but it's lots of interesting depth and texture going on within its dial. Width is just under 42mm without the crowns, and 44 width. Lug to lug is a little longer than I'd like at just under 50, but the lugs slope down nicely, so it's very comfortable wear. Lug width is 20mm, which is a little small for a 42mm diver, but I think it looks good here proportionally. The case is rather circular and minimal. It's just mostly that dial and bezel that you see, so 20mm works here. Plus, I always find 20mm strap a little more comfortable than 22. The watch feels a little heavy at 98 grams, but it really feels nice and well built and solid in the hand. The price is listed as $285, but that's actually before the usual Spinnaker discounts that are floating around. So after 20%, it's more like $228. Which we'll talk more about at the end. Now, I've saved water resistance and thickness until the end, as they kind of go hand in hand here. Now, water resistance was increased from the previous model, which was only 150 meters, to a now 180 meters, which is always a good thing, but 180 meters is kind of an odd number. And I'm not really sure there was anyone who wasn't going to buy it at 150 who suddenly will at 180. The bigger issue at hand is that this also increased the thickness from the previous model. Now spec says it's 15, but I've actually found it to be more like 14.5, so it's not quite as tall as it sounds. So it is tall, but it is still manageable. But personally, I'd rather give up those extra 30 meters of water resistance to make the watch a little thinner. And I'd even remove the exhibition case back and go to more of a closed case back if I could get it just a little bit thinner. The case shape here is minimal, and even though it does sometimes look like a hockey puck with legs, I actually really like the look. It doesn't get in the way, and it just helps to keep your eyes focused on the dial. And the finishing of the case itself is actually really good. It's brushed throughout, but with the bezel and the case back having a more circular brushing, while the side is vertical, which does create a very nice two-tone effect with the light when looking at it. The crystal is a flat sapphire, and I like how the edge of the crystal, the angle matches the angle of the bezel and just looks like a continuation of it. And I also like how well the bottom of the lugs are routed out, which I think helps maintain that rounded case shape as well as reduce the weight. 2 crowns are at the right. The bottom one is a screw down and controls the movement, while the unsigned one on the top actually controls the internal bezel. And there are 2 things to note about that bezel. The first is that the bezel action itself is really nice and smooth, and is actually an improvement from the first version. It's really just buttery smooth when rotating it. The other is that it's also not a screw-down crown, which I find rather interesting. And one of the main reasons I'd say that this is more of a dive-style watch than a real diver. Which there's nothing really wrong with. Most people just wind up desk diving with their divers. But it is something to be aware of, and it is different than the other 2 compressor-style watches I have, which is not necessarily a bad thing, and hear me out here. When I wear a dive watch, I frequently use the bezel just to keep track of things. Just the other day I dropped my car off for service and I set the bezel to remind me of how long I'd been waiting. But whenever I wear those compressor style watches, I almost never use the bezel. And I'll admit it, I am lazy at times. But it's a couple of extra steps, not only to unscrew it and then set the bezel, but then to unscrew it and reset the bezel when you're done before my OCD kicks in. So as a result, I never really use them. So while the crown here may be less than ideal for extended water conditions, it's actually much more convenient for everyday life. The bezel is more of a plastic ring with raised indices and small dots for minute indicators, which for some reason just really remind me of Legos. It looks a little odd and maybe a little plasticky. And one thing I don't like is how the bezel bounces up and down as you rotate it. But I need to point out that here, zooming in really exaggerates some of the flaws. And the actual user experience is much nicer than this looks here. Zooming out, the bezel has a very smoky-like appearance. And for a while, I thought there might even be another crystal on top of that and the main one. While zoomed in, these little dots do look odd, but here I think they look cool, and kind of a unique type of indicator. And I really love the effect of these raised indices. It even helps give the dial some extra depth. Depending on the light, they may even cast a small shadow on the dial itself. So while fine details are important, you also have to look at their effect on the overall design, which I think is well done here. And in some ways, I think that actually describes the Bradner in general. There are some details that look odd when you focus in on them, but don't let that completely distract you from the whole picture. Seeing the forest through the trees and all that. Moving closer to the center, you have a metallic chapter ring for the dial itself. It's kind of this gunmetal gray with indicators painted on in black, so not a lot of contrast going on here. And depending on the light, sometimes you can't even tell if anything is written on it until you look close, which I think some have actually criticized this about the design, but I think it's actually a smart choice. Having an obvious chapter ring with numerals right next to the numerals on the bezel, I think could look redundant. So here, I think they blended it into the background, so it's there when you need it, but otherwise it's just sort of camouflaged into the design. Which I think helps keep your attention on the dial and the bezel, which matter more. And that dial here is just beautifully done in sunburst blue. And there are also black and green dial versions, as well as these recently announced ones that come with a bracelet. Now, back to the dial, silver indices are applied with yellowish loom. They are a little small and kind of square, but I think they look good proportionally to the dial area. The funny thing is to me that they really remind me of LED lights. Now, a nice frame is around the date window in white, and I really like how they went with a black background and white text. It looks nice overall and just sort of blends in with the overall design. Meanwhile, the Spinnaker logo does stand out a little with its silver cursive font. It's a little long, taking up a little too much dial real estate, but I think it looks good against the dark blue. And I also love the little pop of color on the orange water resistance at the bottom, which goes along with the highlighted outline of the lollipop on the second hand. The minute hand here is baton-shaped, while the hour hand is whatever this actually is. It's sort of snowflake-ish and maybe a little plunger-ish. But whatever it is, I actually really like the look. Whoever designed the Bradner's dial, I think did a really good job and deserves a cookie. It's a little busy and there's a lot going on, but it all works well together, and it just winds up being visually cool and interesting to look at. There are two things I do want to stress about it. The first is that on some level the hands seem small, but that's just a side effect of the compressor style case. They are the proper length for the dial itself, but it's just you have that chapter ring and the bezel inside the crystal as well, which gives the appearance of a bigger dial than there actually is. The second, and this may be a little strange, but I appreciate the contrasting geometry. Most of the Bradner is defined by very circular shapes. You have a very rounded case, a rounded bezel, chapter ring, and dial. It's sort of a ring within a ring within a ring, Until you actually get to the hands and the indices, which are just these square blocks. And I think it just helps them visually stand out and just look more interesting to your eye. And that brings us to the loom, which honestly I was a little disappointed with. It's not bad, it's just not good, which is disappointing because they said they actually improved it for this version, so maybe I had some higher expectations than I should have. So I threw it up against what I consider to be good and just okay for divers, which is a Seiko Turtle and a Vostok Amphibia. And after 40 minutes, the Bradner's just barely there, but so is the Vostok, although it's nowhere near as good as the Turtle or the Citizen ProMaster. So just for curiosity, I threw it up against my other compressor-style watches. And again, we pretty much have the same results, that it's just as good as a Vostok Amphibia. So as regular watches go, the Loom here is okay. but as divers go, it's kind of subpar. Now, movement-wise, we have the workhorse Seiko NH35a, which at this point you've all pretty much seen, so you know what to expect, and I think it's a good choice here. Which leaves us with the strap, which is this thick tan vintage-style leather one, and it's actually been treated to be water-resistant, or more water-resistant. It may not be the best choice if you plan on always being in the water, but I think it looks good with the Bradner. It's got good hardware, and it's a very nice thick leather strap. Although even with it being that thick, it's not overly stiff, and actually quite comfy when wearing it. Although while the strap is good, I think the tan color here is a little dull compared to the dial. Yet Spinnaker also sent along this black Tropic rubber strap, which if you pre-order the Bradner was actually included, although that offer is long gone, but they sent it to me anyways. I will say this about it, it's good, if not slightly pricey on its own. In fact, I think it's actually better than good. After wearing the Bradner on it, I'm completely convinced that this is the strap it should have come with. It has a nice texture and it's not too stiff or too flexible, which can sometimes be a problem with both rubber and silicone straps. So not only is it more comfortable, but visually I think it looks better than the leather one. Now you can buy it extra, but as I said, it's a little pricey. But keep an eye out for other promotions where Spinnaker might include one of these. Overall, I like the Bradner, and it's no surprise why they sold out last year, as well as they've already sold out this year with the new version. So hopefully, if they're not already back in stock, they will be soon. When you look close, you do start to see some flaws, but as a whole package, I think it works well together. But that's not to say that there isn't room for improvement. There is, especially in the Loom. It doesn't need to be Seiko good, but it at least needs to be better than a Vostok. Now, the list price of the Bradner is a little high, but I think with the discount it's okay, especially when you consider the complexity of the dial, and you are getting sapphire here. Yet, if this is going to be your first dive watch, I'd probably point you in a whole other direction. Although if you already own a dive watch or two, and you want something completely different for a new watch, then the Bradner could be a good choice. Anyway, let me know in a comment what you think about the Bradner, especially if you help them sell out. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.